Hi there, this is another video in the series looking at Joomla 4 concepts with a particular view to upgrading components to Joomla 4. And in this particular video we're going to look at the router. In fact, this is going to be first of two videos looking at the Joomla router. So let's look at overall what does the router do. So it's involved in two aspects within Joomla. The first is whenever you get an incoming HTTP request, this is an example, then the router needs to parse that HTTP request in order to get to the internal format of the URI. So it needs to work out which component, for example, is going to be run from this URL and the parameters associated with that component, as well as the menu item that it's going to be attached to and the language. So there's a parse that needs to be run whenever we have an incoming HTTP request and we need to process it, and that's what this video is going to be looking at. The opposite is the build, and we're going to look at build in the next video. So if we look at what's involved in the router, there's a number of classes. There's the router and the site router, which you will find in, well, if we look at libraries here, source router, there's router there, and there's site router there. And as you can see, the site router extends the router. As well as that, we're going to have a number of component routers, including our Hello World component router. So anywhere where you've got a custom router, you're going to have a component router class. So there will be a number of these on a Joomla instance. As well as that, if it's a multilingual site, you're going to have a language filter plugin, and it is going to be in the plugins directory in the system folder there, under language filter, so we're going to bring that in as well. Okay, let's look in a bit more detail about what's involved in parsing URL. Notice I'm looking at SEF URLs. SEF URLs are really just URLs which have this nice format up here, where you've got these slashes, as opposed to what you have on the administrator side, which is this sort of thing where a lot of the detail is in the query parameters. And the SEF URLs are set up with the global config under site search engine friendly URLs. So that's what we're going to be looking at, an SEF URL. And if we look at the various components of that, we've got first of all the scheme, HTTP, the domain name, the folder where I have installed this Joomla instance. So this is really what they call the base of the Joomla instance, and it really plays no part in the routing, because that part is going to be common to all the URLs going into this Joomla instance. It's got an index.php, the entry point, which may be absent if you're using URL rewriting. It's got a language tag, which is going to be next. EN means it's in English. And then this really, from here on, is the main bit that the router has to tackle. And just as a matter of terminology, these are known as segments, the bits of text between the slashes. So whenever the router is parsing an SEF URL, first thing it does, it removes the base and the entry point, so all of this stuff here, because they're not really relevant to the routing. And then the language is determined, so that will be set up against the application. And then the site router tries to find the menu item which most closely matches the final segments. So the key thing is here, Joomla is going to look through the menu items. So that's all the menus on the system, on the site. And it's going to look at the aliases of these. and it's going to try and match the aliases of the menu items on the system with this string here, and it's going to go as far as possible down this string, matching the menu item on the system. Here I've got a menu item of message, and if we look here, this menu item, which is hidden, we use it for the Ajax messages, has got an alias of message, so it's going to find that menu item, and that menu item is what's going to be taken as the menu item for this incoming URL. It's then going to look at the next bit, 21 high, and it's going to look at its parameters associated with this menu item. So if I click on it here, we can see the parameters. So this is com hello world, so it's going to be running our hello world component of this. It's going to be running view, the view hello world view of that, and it's got associated with this an ID 18, and the ID 18 isn't going to match this here, right? So in that case, it's going to take that last bit and hand off to our custom router to work out what that should be there. And 21 high is going to match somewhere down here. It's going to match this one here, which has an ID of 21 down the right hand side here, and has got an alias of high. And the scheme that we're using, we're taking the ID hyphen alias, and then when we actually put that URL in, we find this hello world record high, which is going to have an ID of 21. So the parser has done its work there. I should also say submenu items can be chained. So for example, I've put in a menu item here, sub hello world, and if I click on that, you can see that the URL is going to be hello world / sub hello world. So when it's parsing that URL, it's going to go through the menu items. It's first of all going to find hello world here, and then it's going to look at the submenus and it's going to find sub hello world. So in this way, the menu items can be chained in this section of this SAF URL. It doesn't have to be just one, it can be a chain of them through the submenus on the system. Right, so let's have a look at the code, and here we have the main items of which are involved in the routing, and there's two stages in this routing. The first stage is to inject the rules. So we're going to look first of all at the parsing, and if I go and look for application and site application and look for root, so site application is the PHP file which is run early on whenever you have an incoming URL that's handled by Joomla, and it does initialize the app, and straight after initializing the app it calls this function root. And if we look at root is here, and root is the function which handles the parsing of the URL. And if we look at what it's doing here, it's getting the container, which is the DI container, which we covered in a few videos ago, and it's going to get site router class, and it's going to call parse on it. So if we look at site router and what class that is, and we find that that is going to be serviced by our service provider. So there is a router service provider class, which really results in the site router class getting put into the, here's the thing here, site router class getting put into the main DI container. So we see this line here which causes this to be put into the main DI container, and it's going to return, when it gets that item out of the container, it's going to return a class called site router, which is CMS router site router, which is what we've just got here, CMS router site router. So whenever it gets this out of the DI container, let me go back to whenever it gets it out of the container, it's going to run parse on it, as I said. But when it gets it out, it's going to instantiate the site router. So what is going to happen is its constructor is going to be run. And if you look at its constructor, it's got all these things called attach parse rules. And this is actually putting a number of parse rules into the main router class. So attach parse rules as a function is found in our class here, and it just adds those into the set of rules which is defined up here in our router class. So as I say, basically what is happening in this site router, in its constructor, it is injecting rules into the router. So the router, in those data items called rules, it's going to have these parsing rules, and it's divided into three. There's pre-process, and there's a main stage, and then there's kind of tidying up at the end. And after that, it's going to run parse within the site router. And if we look within the site router for parse, we're not going to find it because it is in the main router class. And parse is just going to process those rules, process parse rules. The pre-process, the main ones, and the post-process. These processed before are really just the same thing. As you can see there, pre-process, the main stage, which is just blank, and post-process. So that's what's going to happen there. If we look at the language filter plugin, the language filter plugin is, let's go back to the language filter plugin. Is going to be run on after initialize. And we looked at the site application and we saw that routing was done. The route was called after the application was initialized. And at the end of the app initialization, it will call this on after initialize trigger. And this is going to do a similar sort of thing. So it's going to get the site router out of the container. Now this will actually be done before that route call. So it's going to be the first thing which gets the site router out of the container, DI container. But if we looked at the, where is it? Looked at this here, we've got share. So share means that when the site router is taken out for the next time, it's going to be the same instance. So it doesn't really matter that this is kind of taken out first. Whenever it's taken out after the app is initialized and that route is called, it's going to get the same site router instance. And then it's going to attach a parse rule here. So again, this language filter plugin is going to inject a rule, this parse rule, into this. Now these parse rules, I haven't listed all of them here, but you can look and see what each of them are doing. For example, the parse init rule, it's going to remove the base and the entry point. So it's the bit that is going to get rid of this bit here at the start. The next bit is the parse rule, and the parse rule is going to handle the language code. So the parse rule you can find in that language filter. There, and it is going to deal with that language aspect here within the parsing of the URL. And then the main thing is going to be this thing here, parse SEF route. And the parse SEF route is what does the main work of finding the matching menu item and then handling the remainder. And the remainder then, if there is a remainder, is going to then get put into our component router, and it's going to get called parse there. So finally, let's look at our component router. And the component router gets involved when the site router has determined the menu item, and so the component, but there remains unparsed segments. I should say that whenever you determine the menu item, the important aspect of the menu item is not just the component that you need to call, but also it's got here the template. So, and it's also got here the module assignment. So depending on what menu item you select, you will also find the template associated with that menu item, and you'll find the modules which are going to be put on that menu item page. So it's key to determining how the page is presented, not just working out which component is going to be run there. So the site router has determined the menu item and then the component, and then it gets the component router. So we're going to have a look at that. Site router get component router. So if we go back to our code in site router, and we're going to look at get component router. Here's the function here. And if we look at the code here, it's checking if this is set, which usually, well, for the first time it's not going to be set, but then it's doing this component instance, is this app boot component. And hopefully that will sound a little bit familiar from when we initially looked at boot component, which was way back here. And we found that whenever an item within the Joomla core wanted to access our component, it went through this common function boot component, which first of all ran our services.php file, servicesprovider.php file, which is this one, and then got that out. And what you got out of it was this thing which had a component interface, which was a hello world component, which was our extension. So this line in our site router is doing that. It's getting a component instance, and that component instance is going to be our hello world component, and it's going to get that via this mechanism of pulling it out via this boot component function. The next thing it's going to do is if component instance is an instance of router service interface. So our hello world component is indeed does indeed implement router service interface, and this is why it's necessary to explicitly set this on our extension, because if it doesn't get set there, it's not going to run what we need it to do next. And the next line it's got is it sets that component instance and it calls create router on it. And if we look at where create router is, well, create router is actually going to be in our router service trait, which is in component router service trait. And our router service trait does indeed have our create router function, and here's it here. And it's going to return from that function, it's going to return this router factory create router. So it's going to be another create router function, but in a different class. And it's going to be in the router factory class. Router factory is set to null there, but needs to be set here by calling set router factory. So where does it get called set router factory? Well, if we look back in our services provider.php file, whenever we get this class set up, one of the first things we do in our extension is we call set router factory. And we call set router factory and we get for it router factory interface. We get out of our DI container, our child DI container, this router factory interface. And this is what is going to be set by this here. So our router factory is going to, this line here, is going to run our extension service provider router factory here. And here's our router factory interface class, which is the same as router factory interface class here. And what we're going to get back is we're going to get back Joomla CMS component router factory. Joomla CMS component router factory. Joomla CMS component router factory. And this is what has got our create router in. So this is the router factory which has got that create router in. And here's the class it's going to be looking for here. So it's going to be looking for our namespace, which is the hello world namespace. It's going to get the application name, which is going to be site, and it's going to add on service router. So it's basically going to be going to our site source service and this file router.php. Now all that is a bit complicated way of getting it, but it's actually all detailed here in this line here, how it goes through to get it. And I've gone through that because it really is quite important to get this right, and it can be frustrating if you don't get your services provider.php file right and you don't know where it's going wrong. So it's important to understand roughly how that is working out where the router is. And as I say, the next thing, it's going to find our site service router, and then it's going to call parse on it. Now, the parse is going to pass in segments. So these are going to be the segments here which are not yet analyzed. It's then going to expect back the variables containing the view and ID to be returned, and the segments array it expects to be empty, which is actually something new in version 4. In version 3, as far as I remember, it didn't require the segments to be empty. Now it does. And the matching menu item will have been set as the active menu item. Now here we've got a choice. We can either write our own custom router as we did in version 3 with our own parse and build, or we can use the router view class. Now I'm going to talk a little about router view in the next video, but if we just look at our own class here in our extension, what I've done here in the code is that, remember the code to find the component router, it was wanting to call create router, right? So, and that was called provided within the router service trait, but because that's a trait, we can actually override that function. And if you want to use the normal custom router that was in version 3, you just write your own create router, and that I've got just returning a traditional router, and the traditional router, I've given it the fully qualified name there, which means that it will come down to traditional router here. And this is in the code as well up on GitHub. And here we have our build and parse functions, really as the custom router we defined in version 3 of the tutorial. And if we just look at this, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you can see it gets past the segments. And here we've got the active menu item. So we've got the fact that it's got set to the active menu item, and we can use that if we want later on. We've also got a vars parameter here, which gets set up in various places and gets returned at the end. And we've also got the segments here at the end being unset. And notice there's an ampersand there, so we're treating this as pass by reference. So whenever we change this segments array, then we're actually changing the original one rather than a copy. And what we're doing here is we're looking through the categories, the Hello World categories, and trying to match the categories, and going down through the nested set. There may be a number of categories. So for example, if we go to, I think it's somewhere over here. Sorry, one moment. If we go through here, we've got 19 English. Here we've got our menu and submenu item. Here we've got our category. Here we've got our ID. And there could be a number of categories there in a line if we put it further on down the tree, so it has to do that. At the end of this, it's assumed that there's just one ID, so it doesn't really support the Hello World records being a nested set. It just takes the first one. But you can see how that can be developed to provide a more general case of parsing the segments, finding the variables, and passing back the variables and unsetting the segments. And that's basically what the custom router has to do, and it completes the first video in this set of 2, and hopefully speak to you again when we look at the build. Thanks for listening. Bye.